Well, last week, Thursday, we had a discussion about the Imbizo that was called by Zulu King Zwelithini to defend his role in the Ingonyama Trust and what the monarch has described as an attack on the Zulu people. We invited a number of guests to reflect on how the Trust Act came into being and where it finds itself today after a number of objections were raised about how it is run by that high-level panel that was led by the former President Kgalema Mothlante. We invited political analyst Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana to look back at how the legislation that created the trust came to be. The Inkatha Freedom Party took an exception to how that discussion was framed, and they've asked for a right of reply. Well, the IFP's national spokesperson, Mkhuleko Hlengwa, is now in the studio with us for a conversation about that. So, good evening to you, and thank you obviously for coming in. Just to get the facts straight, what was it precisely that you objected to?
Good evening, and thank you very much, Bongani. Well, at the outset, one of the utterances made was that the Ingonyama Trust came into effect because it was an arrangement between the IFP and the NP government. Now, that's a total distortion of history and seeks to make the Ingonyama Trust a political tool, whereas it's not. The reasons why the IFP was not going to contest the elections were twofold. One was that the role of the monarch was not actually clearly defined, and secondly was that of traditional leaders. This led to the Kukuna Declaration, which was facilitated by the now late Professor Okomo of Kenya, who actually brought all the parties together. And the promise made was that there would be international mediation post the elections. It was precisely for that reason then that the IFP then said, if that's the commitment, we'll enter into the elections. The issue of Ingonyama Trust is totally separate. And the issue there is there was Legislative Assembly at the time decided that it would actually run the motions of the Ingonyama Trust bill, which happened in full daylight, in broad daylight, and was championed by Prince Mcebisi. So what we would want to clarify for the South African public is that Ingonyama Trust was not an arrangement between the IFP and the National Party government. In fact, you will recall that the IFP's participation at CODESA almost came to a grinding halt, because amongst other things was the fact that once the ANC and the NP agreed, that was known as sufficient consensus to move on issues. So we do not want then the Ingonyama Trust matter to be converted into a political football, which it, of course, the political nuances will be there, but for it to be pegged on the reasons why the IFP, although going to contest elections, makes the bill an IFP bill, whereas in fact it was a bill for the people. It went through all the motions, public hearings, and it was, of course, signed into law. And subsequently, the Parliament amended that bill in a democratic dispensation in South Africa, and there was sufficient consensus there as well. So we
all right. So in your letter to the SABC, and this is what you wrote, you obviously referring to myself, said the news anchor repeatedly made factually incorrect and unfounded allegations and averments about the IFP and the Ingonyama Trust, saying the only reason the IFP participated in the 1994 election was because of a concession made to start up the trust and to secure the land. That's the letter you wrote to the SABC, which has, of course, led us to this discussion. What I want us to do now is to play a little clip about exactly how that conversation with Professor Ndletyana. Obviously, we can't play all of it, but certainly we'll set the record straight in terms of how the question was framed at the start of the conversation. Have a listen and a look at this. Almost 1/3 of all land in KwaZulu-Natal, that's what's at stake if the Ingonyama Trust were to be scrapped. As you saw in that package yesterday, thousands of people descended on Ulundi to attend that gathering called by the Zulu King, who says any attempt to repeal the trust, of which he is the sole trustee, would be akin to a provocation of the Zulu nation. Well, today the leader of the economic freedom fighters, Julius Malema, came out in support of the King, saying that the statements made at yesterday's Imbizo were no more inflammatory than statements made by others who've made pronouncements on land. The Ingonyama Trust has found itself under unprecedented pressure against the backdrop of accelerated political determination to see land reform implemented, and following the release of that report 2 years in the making by a panel chaired by former President Kgalema Mothlante. We're joined now on the line by the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections, Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana. Good evening to you and thank you for your time. Firstly, is it simplistic to recall that the legislation that set the trust up as having been concluded in the dying days of apartheid was in a way to appease then Inkatha and to get them to participate in the 1994 elections?
Yes, it was concluded actually days before the 94 elections as a way of getting the king to be part of the democratic order. So in doing that, they made a number of concessions to the king, which meant that he would control that land more. There is no accountability. There is no consultation. People who live on the land, his subjects, are not informed about what is happening. Concessions have been given to a number of businesses, and people are never told. Profits that are made from such initiatives are never disclosed. So there is a lot of secrecy around how that trust administers the land. And for a piece of land that is supposedly communally owned, that's a serious violation. So what government seeks to do here is, with any public institution, it must comply with the law. It must live up to its own promise as a public institution run on behalf of the people. And in this case, that is not what is happening.
Right, obviously, as I said, we can't play the entire conversation, but I think that sets the context of how at least was started. Now, specifically from what you've just heard there, which is a little different from what you said earlier, what exactly were you unhappy with?
Well, one, the Ingonyama Trust Act was not a deal for the IFP to enter the elections. Secondly, I think it's unfortunate that we're not playing the final bits of Professor Ndletyana's commentary, where he went on a diatribe par excellence, unprecedented for an analyst. In fact, it was a personal attack on the prince and the king. And I think the fact that we think such things is analysis is a total insult to those who actually do a proper job of that. Of course, we know that President Ndletyana has always harbored anti-IFP views and will use any platform to try and denigrate
Sure,
us.
but get into the specifics of what you're not happy with.
Secondly, I'm not the spokesperson for the Ingonyama Trust, but I can assure you that my capacity as a member of parliament, I know for a fact that the Ingonyama Trust Act is administered through the PFMA, audited by the Auditor General, and the fact that anybody would make a suggestion that nobody knows is an insult, because the books of the Ingonyama Trust are public knowledge.
Okay, we'll come to those specific things, but let's just go back to the history. I've got in front of me the joint statement that was issued on the 19th of April in 1994, and it's a joint statement that was signed by the leaders of the IFP, Prince Buthelezi, as well as Nelson Mandela in his capacity as the leader of the ANC, and F.W. de Klerk, of course, as not only the president of the country at the time, but the head of the National Party. And amongst other things, it lists a number of issues that made them have that declaration. And one of them says, the undersigned parties agree to recognize and protect the institution, status and role of the constitutional position of the King of the Zulus and the Kingdom of KwaZulu, which institutions shall be provided for in provincial constitution of KwaZulu immediately after the holding of the said elections. The 1993 constitution shall for this purpose be amended before the 27th of April in accordance with Addendum A, which is listed in the agreement. Now, the only constitutional legislative change that was made in the run-up to the elections was precisely the act that saw the birth of the Ingonyama Trust.
It was not a constitutional change.
No, I'm saying the only legislative change that was made in the run-up from the 19th of April before the 27th of April in 1994 was the act that enacted the Ingonyama Trust.
Let me clarify two things. One, Prince Buthelezi was the head of the KwaZulu Legislative Assembly, and government rather, and not in his capacity of the IFP.
Right, the declaration is signed, there it is, in his capacity as the leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party.
I'm coming to that declaration. None of those commitments were ever made, and it's precisely for that reason why even the subcommittee of December 2000, where international mediation was promised, the subcommittee of a democratic government in December 2000.
With respect, you're not answering what I'm asking
I'm saying to you, none of the commitments were ever met.
No, that's not true.
None of them were ever met.
That is not true.
The Ingonyama Trust was not an act of the national government.
You're not entitled to your own facts.
It's not my own facts.
I'm telling you what the facts are. I've got the declaration.
And I'm telling you.
Please let me finish. This declaration was issued on the 19th of April in 1994. It is the only commitment that was made that saw that legislation that created the trust. It was that condition that the IFP participated in those elections. There it is, in black and white.
And I'm saying to you with all due respect, that none of the commitments in there were ever met.
We can talk about the other commitments, but what was met was that the Ingonyama Trust was enacted based on this declaration. The Ingonyama Trust was not birthed on the basis of that declaration. The Ingonyama Trust was birthed on the recognition by the KwaZulu government. When was the act promulgated?
That the commitments which were made in there.
So when was the act promulgated?
And that's why I've said repeatedly.
I asked you now then, when was the act? When was the act that created the Ingonyama Trust promulgated?
The commitments of the IFP and the commitments of the KwaZulu government are two separate matters.
No.
It is precisely for that reason why at Kodesa, the IFP made it repeatedly a point that the king had to have his own representation and the IFP had its own delegation, the KwaZulu government had its own delegation. And I want to put it on record today that none of those commitments were made. The Ingonyama Trust Act is a totally separate matter which had nothing to do with that declaration.
That is
and
not
the commitment
true.
And
that is not
and
true.
Professor Okumo, God bless his soul, who had facilitated that declaration,
yes,
had repeatedly raised his own concerns at the fact that he facilitated a process which did not result in fruition. In 1994, the Kukune Declaration, which saw the IFP enter into the election, has never been met with a commitment. Now,
okay,
I know, of course, that
we
you
can
may
run
say
around
these are
in circles.
such circles.
We can run around in circles. I've asked you a very specific question. We can talk about the other commitments and whatever else the IFP may feel aggrieved by. That's not what I'm asking you about. But that is not what I'm asking you about.
We are placing in context as to how we arrive.
Will you accept that you're not answering what I'm asking you about?
I am answering you.
No, you're
not. I'm saying to you, none of those commitments were made.
I'm saying to you, this particular commitment is what saw the Ingonyama Trust created days before the election. There's no other legislation you can point to. Let me finish. There's no other legislation you can point to that would fulfill what is on this declaration.
Exactly.
Except the Ingonyama Trust, which was created days before the election. That's the only reason the IFP participated in that election, and you know it.
The Ingonyama Trust Act does not give recognition to the king.
It gives recognition to his role in terms of what was agreed upon.
That commitment was to give recognition to the king. It was to give recognition to traditional leaders.
And it specifically states that before the 27th of April, there will be legislation enacted that does precisely those things. The only legislation that was enacted was the Ingonyama Trust Act.
International mediation was promised to clarify that particular aspect of the declaration. It has not happened. So I would want, for the purpose of not going around in circles, as you say, to put it categorically clear that the Ingonyama Trust must not be pegged as a commitment which saw the IFP go into elections. We still have an outstanding matter. We have raised it with the ANC. It is precisely for the reasons we have 3 asides, 5 asides, and 10 asides to say there's unfinished business, and would not be raising that had the issues in that commitment and that declaration had been met. The reason was
we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. I mean, we could have carried on about the loss of the IFP's parliamentary footprint and where you find yourselves today. But I'm afraid we don't have enough time for that conversation.
We'll just provide time and we'll answer it. And it's precisely for that reason why you're doing well in by-elections. We did it in 2016. It was on an upward trajectory.
But
so if you wanted to have that conversation, don't stick it in through the back. You'd have just placed it on the table, because when you do that, it leaves a sour taste, and that's not right.
But it is it is factually correct to say that the IFP is a shadow of its former self in 1994. We could have had that conversation.
Your own opinions and your own
we can have that conversation, but we'll have to leave this one.
Provide time and I'll come and we'll have it.
But at the very least, you've had your right.
But thanks for the time nonetheless.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. And of course, we've been following the debate on land on this issue. And now we're going to hand over back to